Preflop ranges can have a huge impact on the rest of the hand, and the difference between what GTO suggests and what population actually does can be extremely big. The point is looking into 4-bet ranges. So here players are 200 big blinds deep. So again, it's a little bit different than what I analyzed in the 100 big blind stacks. However, there's also an ante, so the effective stacks are a little bit lower than 200 big blinds. The exact details are not important here. It's more about how ranges are constructed in general. So we will not go through the composition of the big blinds 3-betting range. It's polar and includes a lot of value and some bluffs. The hijack's 4-betting range now is very tight and even more polar. So we can already see that kings mostly just flat here. And that is not only the case 200 big blinds deep, but also 100 big blinds deep. Queens almost never 4-bet here. All of these lower pocket pairs as well. A lot of ace-x and king-x suited hands that work as bluffs, right? So, of course, frequencies are not extremely high for each of these hands, but we can see ace-9, ace-8, ace-7, ace-5, ace-4, ace-3, and then king-jack to king-9 would include some 4-bets here. And that is simply not happening as often in practice. People don't 4-bet as often as this GTO solution would, which means, and at the same time, they also 4-bet kings more often. Again, this is 200 big blinds deep, even 100 big blinds deep. Kings would 4-bet a little bit more often, but not extremely more often. So still, I think it's more calls than folds that the solver would go for. That has a big impact on how we want to play as the big blind here. So against the GTO 4-bet, we can see we can comfortably call all ace-queen suited, all ace-jack suited, ace-10 suited. These are in here for low frequency because we don't 3-bet them as often. We mostly call them already against an open raise. But still, if we 3-bet them, then we can always call. Same for pocket queens, pocket 10s, and all these lower pocket pairs. When we are in a 4-bet pot, we have decent equity against a range that includes a lot of ace-king and also a lot of ace-x and king-x, right? And therefore, this calling range against a 4-bet looks quite decent, doesn't it? Well, it does, but only in GTO, because in reality, if we see population 4-bet much less of these hands and even more of these hands, then that has an extreme impact on our range that we can continue. This is the GTO 4-betting range for early positions. So the hijack in this example, 100 big blinds deep. And this is the range that data showed population was much closer to play, which does include much less 4-bets. 100 big blinds deep, it would be even more king-x that would 4-bet here, and around the same amount of ace-x. Also ace-queen off likes to 4-bet here, and all of these hands are not in population's 4-betting range as often. Ace-king suited is here sometimes, then aces and kings as well, pocket queens even sometimes. So the value to bluff ratio preflop is much heavier tended towards value than in GTO. And the result of that, or how that impacts our range in the big blind, is something we can see as well. So here, this would be a GTO defend in the big blind for us. We could easily jam kings, ace-king, some aces, even some pocket jacks here, which the solver would 3-bet 100 big blinds deep, then ace-5 suited here. And then also, as we saw in this simulation right here, ace-queen to ace-10 suited can always call. Even some 10-9 can call here. 6-5 suited as well, and also parts of these other suited connectors. However, if we assume population to 4-bet less often as a bluff, as we just saw, then that range looks a lot different, right? So this is the result that we see against a 4-betting range that population plays that we just looked at, and that is much different, right? So here only aces, king, and almost ace king suited can purely continue here. Queens even fold most of the time, and then the only other hand is 6-5 suited that can continue here. Everything else is basically a pure fold. So all of these Broadway hands cannot continue against a range that doesn't 4-bet often enough. The difference isn't crazy at first glance. It's not like they never 4-bet bluff or they only have aces. It's not even like that. But still, this slight difference results in such a difference in ranges that we can play as the big blind. Take away two things. First is these Broadway hands are just very, very sensitive to changes in our opponent's strategy. So these hands, if our opponent is 4-betting too light, you want to let go of these much more often than in theory. And the second is that the suited connectors seem to be a little less sensitive towards that, right? So in theory, already 7-8 suited, 6-7 suited would be folding a decent amount. So those becoming pure folds is not a it's not a surprise. But 6-7 suited calls purely in GTO, as would ace queen, but 6-5 suited still calls sometimes, opposed to ace queen, which is a pure fold. And the reason is simply that a hand like 6-5 suited has much more equity against a tight 4-betting range than ace queen. So when you're faced with much more aces, much more kings, much more ace king, and less of these ace x suited bluffs, then ace queen just becomes a much worse hand to have post flop because it's dominated much more often. 6-5 suited, that is not the case. However, when our opponent has more ace kings, even more kings and aces, it doesn't hurt 6-5 suited that much because basically the outs that this hand has, which is more or less 2-pair plus, are still essentially the same, right? But we are, first of all, not dominated by any of these hands as often. So only ace-5, ace-6, and ace-6 is not played like this, are just way better to continue against the tight range.